have enough. All right. Welcome to the Greytown Council Workshop. Yes, it's informal setting.
Thank you. There's printed copies of that.
Oh, thank you very much.
I'm all set.
Uh-oh.
I'm good, thanks, I don't need any.
All right. Yet again, welcome to the September 3rd Greytown Council Workshop. Tonight, we're going to be working on hearing another presentation regarding the proposed zoning changes and the zoning map. And is there anything you want to say before we begin, or have Doug jump right in?
I'll just introduce our town planner, Doug Webster, who's been working on this following some joint meetings we've had and following the comprehensive plan that the town voted on a number of years ago. So I'll turn it over to him.
Part of the reason Doug's hair is gray.
Salt and pepper when I can. Doug Webster, Planning. As the council recalls, there was a workshop that we had right here this past May 14th with the Open Space Committee, Ordinance Advisory Committee, and Planning Board. That was the first draft, if you will, of the proposed new zoning that's predicated on the future land use plan and map that's in the duly adopted comprehensive plan. There was some feedback that I attempted to summarize in the council packet for this workshop on the council packet, page 4. Some of the input at that meeting, there were some white areas that weren't that did not have any proposed zoning districts, and the consensus, at least my understanding of it, was to fill those in. Another relevant input was to look at, or take a closer look at, what abutting municipalities are doing, both from a current zoning perspective as well as what may be in their long-range comprehensive plan. There was a proposal that we consider excuse me, a more general rural district as opposed to separating out the predominantly rural residential from the predominantly rural agricultural. There was a map that was put together. One of the biggest challenges that we had with that was how to handle the gravel pits. And we experimented a little bit with overlay districts, and my understanding of the consensus was that we should try to separate those out, but make them less blotchy, if you will. And so this recent map is an attempt to do that. The council packet for this has a series of maps, and at the end of the memo for this workshop, I have some questions if the council's willing to go through those. There's quite a bit of background, the most relevant of which is that all of the maps, I think all of the maps, most of the maps anyway, retain the future land use areas that are shown on the future land use map in the comprehensive plan. The reason I feel that's important is because those are the areas that were in the comprehensive plan that were endorsed, if you will, by the residents as an integral part of the plan. So as we go through the different areas of town and the proposed zoning, it seems relevant to keep those on the front page, if you will. So that's why those were retained. In some instances, as I detailed on page 3 and on page 3 of the council packet, I did deviate with input from staff and Ordinance Advisory Committee from some of the areas that were shown on the future land use map, and I tried to summarize the reasons behind that in the memo, trying not to be defensive, but there were some instances where I felt as though, again with input from others, that it warranted proposing deviations from the future land use map. I tried to and wanted to be very clear that I am deviating from, in those instances as I listed, that is a deviation from the comprehensive plan, and ultimately it's up to the council. As I pointed out in the introductory memo, the future land use map and plan is not intended to be absolutely rigid. I think there can be some deviations as long as the spirit, the intent of the overall plan is followed. That's a pretty widely accepted planning practice. The map and plan in the comprehensive plan is the overall blueprint, but it does not need to be adhered to rigidly. So,
Any questions?
that's my summary.
I had a few, wording questions. I just wanted to make sure I understood them. So
Go ahead,
sort of
sure.
clarification on page 3. And what you just said made perfect sense to me. So on page 3, under Yarmouth Road, the third bullet in the second sentence, it just mentions the intentions are predicated on minimizing additional commercial traffic through the village, relatively large parcels, and is that maintaining large parcels, or, I wasn't sure what what you meant in that context, but what relatively large parcels meant.
Many of the existing parcels in that area are quite deep from the road. There's some gravel pits out there, obviously, but if you were to compare some of those, particularly if you go past the Depot Road intersection, which again is a deviation from the map that's shown in the comprehensive plan, some of those parcels are quite large, and that was and because of the soils and because of the public availability of public water, it seemed appropriate. I think I just meant relative to other areas of town.
So I just wasn't sure which verb to attach to that relatively large parcels. It's like maintaining them or utilizing them, or?
I think that's up to the property owner.
Okay.
I think the intention was to try to structure the zoning, the future zoning, in a manner that encourages the type of development that is appropriate for that area.
Right, and I think I think you're also referencing in particular the extension of mixed-use residential spaces as appropriate for that transition zone.
Yeah, I think that's.
Okay, that's helpful. And
Well, actually, while we're there,
Yeah.
if anyone else has any questions about that particular area or zone, Krista, do you have anything?
No, I just want to say that I sat in on most of the conversations as part of the Ordinance Advisory Committee, and also was part of the Comprehensive Plan Steering Committee before my time on council. And I just want to comment on what Doug was saying about how, even though he's veered from the future land use map in specific instances, he has, and I think we have made a real effort of honoring that document, and this area in particular for Yarmouth Road, is the intent here is to have it have a residential feel, because it's also very accessible to the village and doesn't have a lot of large scale development there at the current moment. So
One of the questions I had was on, when I look at the future land use map and I look at the sort of combined maps, the two together, they don't look that different to me. So that really wasn't one of my concerns. The part of it, I think, that was a greater concern is that there's some gravel pits when you look at a satellite map of the town that feel like they fit better in the mixed use growth zone than they do in the rural zone, to me. You know,
I had the
ultimately,
same comment, yeah.
ultimately, those are gonna have to be, at some point in time, gravel pits usually grow old and die, and then they're repurposed. They can certainly be repurposed for residential construction, but we have such a small percentage of our area in town that's actually zoned for commercial use, that it feels to me that those are prime areas for that kind of development, more than they would be for residential development. So the fact that this doesn't include and I forget the name of the road, give me a second here, I can tell you.
On the future land use or the?
Either one, actually, because they're not really in either one. But if you go down, what's the name of the road? Hang on, one second, please.
you think of the one off Mayall?
No, is it Underwitten? Underwitted Road?
Underwooded?
Yeah, which is almost across from Depot Road. There are several gravel pits there. The one that includes the property that's a part of the Stillwater Pines development is connected through there too. Though there isn't actually a road connection to that space, but there could be one day. So I guess I'm just wondering, was there any discussion of, but I know you talked about an overlay for the gravel pits, but was there any discussion including those areas in the mixed use or the mixed growth?
The Stillwater parcel, including Phase 2 and the 2B Town multi-use field is currently, the map I put together proposed to be residential.
Right.
You're talking about the parcel to the south, as an example?
Yeah,
Okay.
just the parcels that border that. There's several gravel pits in there.
Yes, there are. So we explored the more general rural district with an overlay for gravel pits. The overarching intention was to attempt to provide easy ability for a future or current property owner to identify where there might be gravel pits. If they were thinking about buying a lot and building a house, we thought it would be helpful if they knew that there was an existing gravel pit operation there. And so we identified all of the gravel pit areas with the overlay. In general, after we experimented, if you will, with the overlay, where we landed was to try to have existing gravel pits in the RA district as opposed to the RR district.
Yeah.
As a means to help current and/or future residents identify where there might be a gravel pit so that they would know that there might be one there.
I guess was there any discussion about, because if they're zoned RA, then if someone comes to us and wants to build a commercial or a light industrial or some other kind of facility there,
Yes.
that wouldn't be allowed in that zone, would it?
I don't know if I would characterize it quite that generally. If you look at the first council packet, page 10, the one that has the colors and the general characteristics of proposed zoning districts, if you look under RA, because the lots tend to be larger and it's more rural, the intention was to, together with maybe some setbacks to property lines and so forth, but as an example, you can see construction services and campgrounds are listed there as examples of uses. So the intention of the RR was to be a little more protective of the residential nature and to open up additional, slightly more intensive non-residential uses in the RA, operating under the assumption that there might be some relevant performance standards associated with whatever the allowed use might be. Does that help?
It does. It doesn't
Okay.
address the issue in my mind, because if someone comes and wants to do something there that's not, that I think is a practical application for those properties, it wouldn't be allowed in this zone.
You're thinking specifically of light industrial?
Yeah, well, yeah, light industrial or even commercial, if someone wanted to build a new, Pine Tree Plaza or something like that. I don't think that would be allowed there. I also think when you look like down the road, perhaps many years, and the desire to get traffic out of the village, the only way we're gonna get traffic out of the village if there's some other way for the cars to go around. And, there are some possibilities that way. They're super long-range plans, but I think we have to start thinking about them now in order to make sure we leave space for somebody in the future to have that option available to them if they need it or want it. We've talked about before, the idea of putting a road from Depot Road down to Turnpike Acres and from Turnpike Acres over to 202. Will that ever happen? Who knows? But if we're truly interested in getting cars out of the village, we've got to provide people another way to move.
And you would propose to do that by setting aside some land for that purpose, like a
Well,
corridor?
at least, if you had some commercial property and you did foresee someday building a road from Depot Road down to Turnpike Acres through there somehow, that certainly, given the condition of the land that's up there, would be more attractive to commercial development than residential development, I think. Maybe if something like that happens, someone brings a big enough project to the council and that becomes a CZA or something along those lines. But when we create the zoning maps, we certainly create expectations of the people who live in those zones for what they can expect to see developed there. And it doesn't feel like this current proposal would allow for that kind of development in those particular areas. If that's not of interest or anyone else thinks that that's particularly important, we can move on. But
I think the trouble that we're having is that, I think in the area you're speaking to specifically, near Depot Road and those current gravel pits there, and what that might look like in 20 years, you're right that perhaps some low-intensity commercial uses would be appropriate. And I do think the way Doug has written it here would allow for some of those. But there are gravel pits around town that are in much more rural spaces that wouldn't be appropriate for that sort of use. So I think we're trying to capture our current state, and also honor the fact that not every gravel pit is in the same part of town. So I think there's some difficulty in where we put gravel pits and what they might look like in 20 years. And you could speak to that, Doug. But
What about, and I believe that Councilor McGuire is familiar with this because he was on OAC, he was the council liaison when we proposed the light manufacturing overlay district. So one concept would be to look at the map that I've put on the table here and then identify areas that have the greatest potential for some light manufacturing or slightly heavier commercial, if you will, and to have those as an overlay district. And that might honor what we were trying to do by trying to keep the gravel pits in RA, but also make it clear that there would be additional commercial uses allowed in the overlay district, very similar to what we have now.
yeah, I mean, I personally like that because I think it telegraphs the possibility to anybody who's buying land in that area of the potential uses that could be used. I mean, whenever we make these kinds of changes, the inevitable and somewhat understandable firestorm is someone bought property in a particular zone thinking it was going to be a particular way, and then something comes along that makes us want to change it. Councils in the past, all of us as councils, have not been particularly good about picking the spot where business wants to move. I'll use Hannaford as a good example of that, and I don't think there's going to be anything that happens in the future that makes us necessarily any better at that. So the more flexible we can make this system, I think the better it would be. So I would advocate for some sort of an overlay zone that adds that flexibility. Mike?
My question is that how hard is it to be, Hannaford, great example. Will it be to change in the future if that comes up? I mean, I don't know the process, I'm new to this, so is it that big of a deal?
It is to the people who live in the zone that obviously thought they were living in a residential zone and now it's partially commercial. They worry about what will happen to the rest of their neighborhood, depending on what moves into in a particular place can affect people's property value. So it can have a real impact on people. So I think the more we can telegraph the possibilities, not saying that any of it's going to happen, but telegraph the possibilities, the better informed people can be. And also, the better future councils will be able to say, we have this system in place, we put it there because, we wanted to alert people to the fact that this is a possibility for this kind of development, and it's within, and it meets the criteria of all the planning that we've done. That's my thought, that's my reasoning.
No, definitely makes sense, and, you know, obviously, none of us can predict the future, but the more we can plan for it, the better off we are.
Well, do you want to move on then and see, do you think is there enough support on the council to see about having some
Yeah.
sort of overlay?
I think
that works that way?
particularly for gravel pits, I think it makes sense, given the difficulty of placing them. But
Ian?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, just for, I don't know if you could do this in 2 or 3 sentences, but just quickly sketch out for those who aren't familiar with the term, what having an overlay district would mean.
Thank you.
Sure, yes, very good point. So, in general, what happens with most municipalities, including Gray, is you have zoning districts, and then within each zoning district, you have uses that are allowed and not allowed, and in some cases, what they call conditionally allowed. And there are typically lot sizes and setbacks associated with each district. So that's what they call that the underlying district. And then there's a concept called an overlay district, and an overlay district can either add or subtract to that underlying district. So in some cases, you have an overlay district that would allow additional uses, like light industrial in this example, and some municipalities have, as an example, an aquifer overlay where there might be uses that wouldn't be allowed, that would have the potential for contaminating the aquifer. So again, overlay, so you have the underlying zoning, and then the zoning on top. It's an additional layer of standards that can either add or subtract to the uses that are allowed in the underlying district.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay. Anything else? All right, let's move on. Other questions?
Yeah, I do, let's see, I always have questions.
I had some questions posed, if the council's willing, of course. I had some more general questions that would help me fine-tune if
Well,
again,
maybe
if the
we can
council's
get at
willing.
ours by looking at yours.
Yeah.
It's your workshop.
I guess I just wanted to piggyback, I think, on what you were saying. It seemed to me that, Dan, was that the RA sounded to me more like sort of R mixed use, MU, and not, so it's not really just ag uses, so that, agricultural uses. So I wonder if that terminology is going to be misleading for people. It's maybe a small point, but it can, encourage confusion. And then if there's an overlay district that supports other commercial activities, then that would speak to that a little bit more.
Maybe a general rural district
Yeah,
as
yeah.
opposed to RA.
go back to
RA or rural / mixed use, that's kind of what I was thinking. I mean, potentially.
I mean, yeah, well, it is essentially mixed use. It's just a rural version of that.
But just sort of
Yeah.
calling it out in the title.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That's probably a really de minimis point.
I do worry that there are a lot of different distinctions, though. I mean, you've got the, rural conservation, rural agricultural, rural residential. I do worry about, and then you have residential by itself, so it does feel like we're splitting it a little finely.
And if I may, part of that was intentional. As an example, if one of my long-term goals here as we fine-tune the zoning map and the standards was, as an example, have a performance standard when you have a residential district, a project in a residential district that abuts a rural district, that there could be standards associated with that. So I tried very carefully to, the use of the term rural and the use of the term residential, I've tried to be pretty careful with, but I agree 100%, and this is your planning school coming forth, that
In
the
the
title of a
distant
zoning
past.
district should be
Yeah.
as descriptive as possible as to the overall character of that district. That you're right on, that's exactly right. And I did try hard.
Yeah.
My other attempt, this works well administratively in town hall. It's always ideal to have new zoning districts that are not the same title as any current district. It just makes it a lot, if you're looking at a description, like, oh, that's based on an old zoning map. So I'm trying very hard to not duplicate any, that's, as an example, that's why I'm proposing to no longer use the term medium density and to morph that, if you will, to residential. So that we'll be able to tell when something comes through the door if that's predicated on an old district.
Can I ask another question?
You all set?
I'm all set at
Yeah,
one, yeah.
go ahead, Mike.
My question is, what if, let's say, Amazon comes to us and says, we want to put in, a warehouse, and they're going to build an extension to the turnpike that doesn't affect traffic, but it's in this rural section over here. Is that going to be easy to change? Can we do that? Or what would happen in that situation?
Well, I don't think it's ever easy to change zones, which is kind of why, this process has kind of been going on for years for us, starting with the
Okay.
comp plan. So that's my own thought on that. Can it be changed? Yes, there is a contract zone process where a developer or a person can come to the council and say they want us to make specific changes to a particular zone, for a particular reason, and we try and negotiate a project that will fit in that zone with whatever exceptions seem reasonable. We did that with Cumberland Farms. We did that with the Stillwater Pines group that wanted to change the street standard up there. So it can be done. Nothing's ever set in stone, really, as much as we try.
If I may, that if there were such a proposal, one of the areas that currently contemplated are the West Gray transition areas. And if you look at council packet page 14, there's a map there that shows in a little bit more detail the different West Gray road transition areas. And then on council packet page 11, there's West Gray, obviously. West Gray 1 through 4, there are sample uses and standards there. So if the town were to be approached, that was the intention, was to try to direct that type of development to that area because of its close proximity to transportation, because it has arguably a minimal impact on most existing residential areas, and because of the availability of land in that area. So that we did try to do our level best to contemplate what different types of uses might be desired in the future and where would those try to be directed. We also tried to take into account the comment at the May 14th workshop that past zoning has been arguably overly prescriptive with commercial uses, and the intention in particular is the Lewiston Road, L1 and L2, as well as P1 and P2, Portland Road, to have those be more general in nature. But if they're larger footprints, the hope was that maybe they would be perhaps best directed to the West Gray transition areas.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, my concern is that we limit ourselves too much to growth in that area, but I understand what you're saying.
Anyone else on this thought?
So, did you have?
No.
Do we want to go through Doug's questions? Is that where we are now?
Yeah,
Yeah.
two thoughts while you raise this subject, if I can. One is I had a question about that particular, Thayer Brook goes essentially between those two zones that we were just talking about,
The West Gray Zone?
the West Gray zones. Is there any protection? There's no protections for we have some brooks that have some issues, or some streams that have some issues. I think
true.
Thayer is one of them. I think the Mill Stream is another one. Both of those in these zones or go through these zones. Given that it's the case, do we have any concerns about these uses near those streams? Or is that something that, I mean, I know the DEP, I know there's plenty of environmental regulations, but we have those regulations now, and we still have these streams that have problems. Do we need to consider that at all in this? Do we have the opportunity, do we create a buffer, a bigger buffer for those streams that, in this particular case, it sort of almost divides that, I have trouble reading the yellow, the west gray transition from the current zone. Does it make sense to think about creating a buffer, in a place like that where we could, to protect the streams?
And well, for those that have been on the council a bit longer, there's been discussion over the past several years about adopting some slightly tougher stormwater standards for the non-attainment. Say non-attainment, there's the Federal Clean Water Act, and there are streams that are in non-attainment, mostly because of oxygen, and which affects the creepy crawlies in the streams. So this is more of a broad brush. I certainly think that would be appropriate to consider. This is really, I'm really trying to stay focused on the broad brush as
Sound
we
too
fine
specific.
tune.
Okay,
As we
sorry.
fine tune, I think that would be, well, and then the other aspect is that in general, commercial uses, I mean, they're typically slab on grade. They don't generate a lot of wastewater, and as long as you take care of the stormwater properly, you're generally okay.
Okay.
So that
It's
was.
just, now seemed if we were gonna do something, the time to do it. The only other question I had was, you mentioned the sort of, P1, 2, and 3, and some of the other distinctions like that you have. And it feels like there's a lot of splitting that into smaller pieces. Is there really a lot of value in having P1, P2, P3? I mean, obviously you think there is because you created it, but I'm just trying to understand the value of that. It feels, again, like it's too prescriptive.
Okay. And perhaps the same with L1 and 2.
Yeah, with a
Yep.
whole bunch of them, actually.
Conceptually. The intention with this second draft, if you will, was to solicit council input on the overall character. I don't think there's any question, and Councilor Chapel, as well as others, have instilled the importance that virtually all of the transition areas are intended to be mixed use. And the intention, as an example, the distinction between P2 and P3, I put that in there to spark conversation. It's working. This is good. I put that in there to say, okay, we've got some larger lots. It's further south on Route 100. We need to be respectful of our neighbors, and we have that natural dividing line, if you will, with that utility corridor. And we were searching for other areas that might be well suited for larger footprint, heavier duty commercial uses, while minimizing adverse impacts on existing residential areas. And that was why that was put on the table that way. If that, again, I'm trying
Yeah,
not
no,
to be defensive, I'm trying
No,
to be
no,
descriptive.
I'm just trying to understand it, that's all.
Right, and just for P3 as an example versus P1 and P2, P3 would be much less residential spaces, and it's also appropriate for the type of development that Doug's referencing, larger commercial uses, because there's larger parcels, they're flat, and it's also much closer to a turnpike on-ramp, being smack dab in between the on-ramp in West Falmouth and here in Gray. But the P1 and P2 spaces would have probably more residential uses and smaller manufacturing. I think so we wouldn't want to see the type of P3 development all through the Portland Road transition zone, I guess. So I think that's the intent with distinguishing the types.
The problem is when someone owns property in P1 or 2 and they want to use it for P3 purpose, what do you do then? Does that mean that's off the table for them, even though they're in that zone, or is there enough flexibility to,
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, yeah.
I think the intention, and I'm happy, obviously, it's up to the council, but I think the intention was for some larger footprint, what I call heavier commercial traffic. And when I say heavier, I don't mean larger volumes, I mean larger vehicles, like
Friends
tractor
Brothers,
trailers
you know,
and so forth.
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So I think the intention was if there were large footprint, heavy commercial vehicle traffic, that the ideal scenario would be to try to direct those uses, and perhaps not others, but those uses to one of the West Gray districts, particularly West Gray 3 and 4, as well as maybe P3. Other commercial uses, retail, light industrial, that type thing, the smaller footprint. I think the intention
Less
is
traffic, yeah.
less traffic, or let's pick on, it's a pretty good example, like West Gray 2. Because of its location, it seems much better suited, from my opinion, for, as I say, in the, what is this, the council packet, page 11. That seems better suited for what I would characterize as like an incubator business, where you might have a series, one building that would have 4 or 5. There would be a combination of an administrative office, and people in trades, as an example, electricians, plumbers, and so forth. And so they could have a little office and administrative functions in the front, and out back they could have a warehouse where they store their goods. So you would have a larger number of smaller footprint businesses in West Gray 2 because of its close proximity, and they would have lighter duty commercial vehicles as opposed to the larger footprint, heavier duty commercial vehicles that might be in West Gray 3 or particularly 4, and then as well as P3.
Okay. I just think, most of our development usually comes from people who own a piece of property who want to develop it. And so that's where the alignment issue becomes a problem, because they don't own a piece of property in P2, they own it in P1, or those are the situations that we get confronted with more than somebody who's looking to come and build a distribution center or to build a facility, and they're wondering what zone's the best one to look for property in.
Yep. And of course, the other big piece, the white elephant in the room, is we don't really have a super definitive handle at this point with what's going to happen with the village growth core. And so I would fully expect that there would be fine-tuning of the transition districts once the vision for the village growth core starts to take shape. My real focus was actually on the overall districts, the rural conservation and so forth. And I thought, okay, well, if I'm fortunate enough to get the council's ear, maybe I should start planting some seeds for the transition districts to help further what might happen in the village, and then at some point what happens in the village and the transition district gets fine-tuned.
Okay. So going to your questions, do you want to just start to go down through them?
But can I just ask, I'm
Sure.
sorry, I'm going
No,
to
go ahead.
delay us just a minute further. So what is the difference between P1 and P2? And in your chart on packet page 11, I don't see any distinction, and I'm wondering why they're separate. They look identical.
I think they pretty much are.
They are.
The intention of putting some parameters around them was to merely identify them for discussion purposes as we go forward. If there were natural dividers, then I tried to
You're not suggesting or proposing any difference in terms of the types of development that can happen in those two transition zones or districts, and so I'm just wondering why even bother? Why just
We
call
could
them
just have,
P1?
we all have P1, yeah.
It could, I mean, P1 and P2 are separated by, I think that's Long Hill there, by Long Hill. I think the attempt was just to put some boundaries on them so that there could be on-point discussions as we begin to fine-tune what's included in them.
I think also P1 was originally the future land use map transition zone and you expanded on it by adding P2, that might also be where you landed on that.
Okay. Right, I'm sorry, just.
No, that's quite right. All right. So your questions begin on our packet page
4.
4. So the comments regarding the input for the overall proposed zoning district boundaries, including RRRA. I think we sort of discussed that a little bit already.
With the overlay? Yep, sure.
I would just say well, do you have a question about the rural critical? Yes, okay, we'll get to that. Number 2 was, does the council support the current proposal that there should be at least 3 overlay districts with appropriate standards for direct watersheds, great ponds, aquifers, and the wellhead recharge areas? These are existing ones, correct? Or are you proposing that we have these?
Watersheds we have a couple watersheds we have indirectly, if you will, with the Lake District,
Yeah.
current Lake District. Aquifers we used to have, and the wellhead recharge we already have. And then, of course, the one we've been talking about tonight is the transferring, if you will, the concept anyway, maybe not the location, of the light manufacturing overlay district.
Yeah, for gravel pits, commercial, yep, okay.
We don't have aquifers currently. I would advocate that there be some very basic standards. I was not here during the infamous aquifer overlay, AOZ, that met with much resistance, perhaps understandably. This would presumably be something that would just disallow uses that had a very high potential to contaminate the aquifer.
The aquifer overlay, when I look at the town website and I look at the map there, that's the easiest way for me to turn that on and off. There are aquifers, for instance, the aquifer that's up by the gravel pits and Depot Road, that's essentially part of the McKinn site. And, I mean, that's an aquifer that we can't use and probably won't be able to use for the foreseeable future, if I'm understanding our current circumstances correctly.
It's
And we-
getting better, they say, but.
Yeah, it's getting better, but we have public water there. So, are you proposing that we would protect all the aquifers in town, or just some of the more important ones?
I think it would be appropriate to have at least some level of protection on all of them. I mean, simply because it's not currently able to be used is not a reason to allow uses that could majorly further adversely affect it for a long time to come.
What would be the uses that would be disallowed in those zones? Or would it, instead of being disallowed, would there be additional protections required for things like septic and stormwater?
I think it would be conceptually similar to the standards that were brought in for gas stations in the village. There would be standards that would be put in place to try to protect the groundwater.
Okay, I mean, I'm not against that myself, I don't know how others feel.
I'm not a geologist, so what is the substantial difference between an aquifer and, say, like the areas where we're recharging our wellheads and where are those? There are aquifers in town that don't recharge our wellhead, I understand that, but what's the value in protecting the ones that are not providing public drinking water?
I think there's a long-term value because the aquifers, the water in aquifers is not just confined to the mapped aquifers. It spreads out.
Okay.
As an example, the map that where the town, there is a I'm looking for the map that shows the abutting municipalities.
Oh, that was,
The eastern portion was at Long Hill, I guess.
packet page 8,
Uh,
yeah.
Yes, thank you. So the abutting municipality, North Yarmouth, has a farm forest with a groundwater protection overlay. And so I proposed a small RC area there for that purpose. I think there's significant long-term value in trying to be proactive, to take steps that don't contaminate the groundwater. When groundwater gets contaminated, I mean, that's
Right.
a,
I'm not saying I'm
that's a
for
generational
contaminating groundwater.
thing.
I'm just trying to understand what's the distinguishing features if we were to have separate overlays between those three things that you listed, so,
If I could just,
yeah.
pardon me, make some general points about
Yeah.
aquifers, I'd like to do that. I mean, I think aquifers are kind of like watersheds, you know, like everywhere is an aquifer.
Right.
But there are certain aquifers that have characteristics in terms of their potential to produce drinking water at certain volumes that make them potentially usable for public water supplies. And generally, I know the Maine Geologic Survey maps sand and gravel aquifers, high-yield sand and gravel aquifers, which I assume correspond to the aquifers that we've identified that we want to protect. And so even if they're not currently being used for public water supply, there is the potential that they could be. And, you know, existing wells have a lifetime, and in the future might be need to be relocated. So I think there are certain sort of high-value resources that are identified and, you know, sort of singled out for higher level of protection. And I think that's what the aquifers identified in
Okay,
Here
well,
you go.
I guess it sounds to me like maybe we don't need standards for 3 different versions of those. That's what I was trying to get at. Like, perhaps we could have standards that, you know, apply to all 3 of those types of things as one standard rather than 3 different ones.
Yeah. I mean, the aquifers, interestingly enough, unfortunately perhaps, are under the areas that we plan to develop the heaviest. So, you know, they're in besides the East Gray Aquifer, which is separate, and I'm looking at the GIS map now, you know, it's the village, it's between here and Crystal Lake, essentially, all along the Route 26 corridor. And you've got the wellhead there. But it does spill down into the main wildlife park and all that land, which is where the Gray Water District has sought to put a well unsuccessfully. And the aquifer gets much bigger and goes off into New Gloucester, where it's much bigger too. Interestingly enough, the people in South Gray who have come to us that have that really high uranium problems, there's no mapped aquifers down that corner of town.
Yeah, correct. It's usually bedrock that produces that high
Yeah.
reading.
Yeah.
The aquifers are more porous, as you know.
So I guess I think Krista's idea of trying to consolidate those, but I'd be in favor of having some sort of an overlay. And you mentioned the RC zone that you put sort of in South Gray there because of the location of the lake and the shoreline zoning. There's a gap there between that and the RC zone that carries on up along Little Sebago Lake. There are some large lots of property in that gap between the two. And there's also, I know, some agricultural, and some connections in Wyndham. We recently had a notice from the Wyndham Planning Board about a development that was going to be on the border of Gray that's near the brook that's down that way. I forget the name of it. So I think trying to connect those two, myself personally, is something that would be worth looking at. But That wasn't one of your questions.
Could connect with RC.
Yeah, I would connect those to RC.
Okay.
Bubbles myself, I don't know how other people feel, but
Which ones? The ones on, towards Wyndham?
the ones, yeah, the one that's in the
The
south corner.
South Gray, and then the
And-
one
yeah.
around Little Sebago?
And the big one, around Little Sebago.
Like a band between Forest and West Gray Road.
Yes, yeah.
I think there were, correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, but I think your intent with leaving that rural residential in that area that we separated those two spaces was because there is currently a lot of residential development in those.
There are some roads that go through there, and there's a lot of residential along the road, but there's a lot of other property off the road. And I think that from the rural, from that standpoint, you know, you can either choose to let that develop more, or you can try to encourage limits on development to what we have there and seek to, you know, not everyone's gonna wanna do it, but seek to encourage people to go to other spots to try and develop. That's just a thought. I don't know if others are interested in that or not, but
Okay.
if there's not any support for that, we'll move on.
Yeah, it does make sense to me to protect the aquifers and the watersheds. I will note, and I understand that, you know, phosphorus is just one form of contamination, but we will be working on a phosphorus control plan. The resiliency committee will be as
Yep.
part of the grant, so, and so hopefully that'll help a little bit.
So I think that's a yes, where there's support for
For the overlays?
the overlays.
If I may, the only the current wellhead 1 and wellhead 2, when that current zoning was adopted, one of the justifications for the 4-acre minimum was to try to minimize the cumulative volume of wastewater for the wellhead. So I guess I would just point out that if we're to honor that intention, that might be one distinction between the wellhead versus the more general aquifer area.
Okay.
So, I mean, one of the things for the density piece, and it, you know, because you have the septic issue, it doesn't necessarily help it, but, you know, if someone has 2 or 3 4-acre lots, and they wanted to put all of that development on one of those lots as opposed to all 3 of those lots in that zone, would that be allowed?
That's where we're headed for some of the more rural districts, I think, from the density versus minimum lot size.
But in specifically as relates to the aquifer overlays, if we're limiting development in an aquifer overlay zone to, say, a 4-acre lot, a minimum size, and someone had,
I
did I
don't think that's going
misunderstand?
to, my strong sense is that's not going to be deemed politically acceptable to have 4 acres in all aquifer areas. I don't think that's going to fly. I could see
I
having some
misunderstood that.
performance standards for septic systems and so forth, but I'm not advocating 4 acres in all aquifer areas. I think that's going to be a repeat of the AOZ.
I misunderstood.
You
that.
were
That's
just
my
talking
fault.
about the current wellhead 1 and 2
Exactly.
districts.
Just the
right?
wellhead.
Just the wellhead.
So that's not going to apply to
So
the
when I was
aquifer
talking about
overlay.
combining those 3 standards, Doug's saying we might need to have a different standard for the
Okay.
wellhead.
My
Yes.
apologies,
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
I may just make one quick point. I just wanted to mention that if the town were to consider wastewater at some point, then those standards could be tweaked
Yes.
to have a different standard with wastewater present.
Yep.
Because that would be, the wastewater would not be discharging into the aquifers or into the groundwater, and you wouldn't have the groundwater contamination like they have in Wyndham, and the reason that they're putting wastewater treatment in the town of Wyndham. So if we're able to get ahead of that and hopefully institute a wastewater treatment system at some point in the town in the near future, then those standards could certainly change.
And certainly protect the wellhead better, too, than our current setup. So,
Yes.
yeah. Yep.
I'd like to think with the technological developments with wastewater, even in the absence of public wastewater, I would like to think that there might be some latitude to allow additional development in the wellhead if we could take care of the wastewater. There's all kinds of treatment now that's available.
Yeah.
And if we can take care of that from a performance perspective, I don't see why we can't allow different types of development there.
Yep, good, okay. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, thanks.
Does the TC endorse the overall character of the proposed districts, RC, RA, RR, and residential?
Did we address the question before that? Sorry. Count question 3.
Oh, I'm sorry. Council input on the boundaries of various transition districts, L1, Y1 to 3, et cetera. We talked a little
We
bit
talked
about
we
that
did touch on
before.
that a little.
Yeah, I struggle a little bit. It was hard to figure out without road names for
Yeah.
me, and especially in areas of town I'm less familiar with. So I don't have, I feel like I don't have a comment on that at this point.
Yeah,
Better
my-
maps.
My
Okay.
take on that is I prefer it to be a little less granular than it is, but I'm also willing to concede that maybe I don't understand completely the value of all the distinctions.
I think Doug was trying to show property lines because he made a real effort to honor
Yep.
property
Yeah.
lines there. But I would agree, maybe just a road name added to, especially the major roadways
Okay.
would help, help us better understand the boundaries.
What happened is I was tasked with starting from the outside of town and work my way in, and I had to stop at a certain point. And so I hit these transition districts, I was, okay, well, I'll at least give them a title, or at least a name, so they can be discussed, and then that led to a general description. It was sort of a big ball of snow or something.
But I think the intent behind this question was you had expanded some of the transition zones, so I think, I don't know if folks are comfortable with that expansion.
Yeah, I have no trouble with the expansion. The transition zones, I think are just a concept that I'm still sort of struggling with in the context of all the other zones. But I think I'm, I spent a while sort of going back and forth on all your great maps, and I feel like I've gotten a little better handle on that. But it's hard for me, not having served on a planning board or worked as a planner, a town planner, really to understand what happens functionally when you start trying to apply all this stuff, which is what you have much greater knowledge of course. So I'm not sure what guidance to give you. For myself, I don't feel like I'm capable of commenting like, L1 needs to move, a quarter mile north or south or whatever. I feel like I can't be that granular.
Thank you for the input. Yeah, Paul.
Conceptually, though, yep.
Yeah.
Matthew, or what? Yeah,
I'm good.
Okay. Now we're into the proposed districts, number 4.
I just had a quick question. Could you help us understand the difference between, say, a medium and a small-sized B&B?
I think a small would be a B&B that would work in a predominantly residential area. Let's pick on the residential area just north of Hannaford, Spruce, Adler. Something that was small enough that had few enough, that had few bedrooms so that it wouldn't upset the neighbors with the traffic associated with it, versus a B&B that had a larger number and had a more intensive use that might require a larger lot size or more parking or adversely affect abutting residential properties.
I think the more we can quantify those labels, the
Yeah.
better we'll be.
Okay.
So, in the neighborhood you pick, you're not talking about a 12-bedroom bed
Oh,
and
no.
breakfast, no.
Not for a small.
No. So, but, maybe, and again, because you talk about traffic and cars, so perhaps, I'm just picking numbers, maybe that's 3, but maybe 12 is a different size.
Okay.
I think that would be helpful to people too, like using the road names for the different areas.
Yeah, I felt in general that it would be, I know there is a set of definitions in the existing zoning ordinance, and so having these terms defined in a glossary or definition section would be helpful, because I had a question about good neighbor standards. I mean, intuitively, they make sense to me. I'm not sure if everybody would agree on how they're defined, and so just what that means, for example.
Yep, they're Article 10
Article 10.
of 402. But
Okay.
anyway.
Oh, okay, I missed that one, thank you.
I digress.
Yeah.
And while you're talking, those sort of standards and definitions, I had the same thought around development constraints.
Okay.
I think from the standpoint of defining development constraints as much as we can as they apply to the particular zones would also be helpful for people. You know, I understand soils is one, slopes is one, wetlands are obviously a developmental constraint. And we talked, and you mentioned in here that you did that, which I appreciate. We used some of those factors, or you used some of those factors with everyone else that helped in delineating these spaces so that we weren't, you know, zoning commercial slope that no one could build anything on. Or in the middle of a wetland or a vernal pool or stuff like that, so I appreciate that.
I tried to cover that with the May 14th workshop, and I thought about adding development constraints as an element to the packet, but I felt as though there was enough here. I'm happy to rewind the tape, though.
Nope, if that's on the list of things to do, that's all I need to know.
Yep, and the development constraints were utilized for the purposes of identifying the boundaries of the transition districts as well. Again, that was one of the other, that was, the council has been, understandably, the council has been very clear that we need to make sure that if the parcel is zoned a certain way, that the majority of it is practically able to be used for that purpose.
Okay. Number 4 then, endorsing the overall character of the proposed districts.
I would say yes, yeah.
Yeah, I think they're really reflective of our intent with the comprehensive plan, and I think they also get to the type of development that we would ideally like, and I'm certainly in favor of them.
Right?
I don't know enough, just to be honest with you, so
No,
I'm
that's
just
fair.
learning.
Yeah, no, that's fair. You know, I've voiced my concern about the, you know, lots of distinction. I think the more simply and well-defined and distinctly defined those things are, the easier the communication will be for people and the easier to understand. That would be my only support there. So I'd say yes, yeah, there is support for that. Number 5, is there consensus for proposed small commercial area ringed by residential for dry mills area, see H and D? We have that map that you.
It is, I think it's one of the last, council packet, page 13.
I liked this idea. I mean, I think it makes sense. You know, if we're talking about reducing road traffic to the village or even just along Shaker Road or you know, Route 26, having, you know, being able to walk to some minimal services in the dry mill area makes some sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it also honors historically what has been in dry mills. What's there now is kind of a shell of what it used to be, from my understanding, but, you know, I know there's a lot of residential spaces and parks and community parks, like Wilkie's Beach is right there, and there's a lot of people who use that as a pedestrian corridor, and I think creating this type of development would be reflective of the uses that were there in the past and also still there today.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it will be critical to sort of outline where I mean, obviously 26 is that corridor that goes through there. Dry Mills could be again, sort of a gateway to Gray from people coming from that direction. I think there is a lot of value in sort of rebuilding, if you will, the neighborhoods that we have of, you know, Dry Mills and South Gray and West Gray, and so kind of, you know, North Yarmouth has certainly done that on 115 there, where I forget the name of where it intersects with I forget the road that goes.
Oh, up to Greeley.
Yeah. So, that feels like a model for what you're talking about potentially for the Dry Mills area.
I think I put it in the descriptor there for Dry Mills, that there may need to be like a master plan, if you will, for access there, because the DOT is probably not going to be very pleased if we propose development that majorly torpedoes the extensive efforts that went into those recent intersection improvements. But
Yeah, I think I like the concept behind this, and I think I brought this up during our ordinance advisory committee meeting, but I think there is a lot of congestion there, especially on mornings during the school year, and if we do encourage more development in that area, we will eventually need to address how to fix any kind of congestion that results.
Well, and when the council passed the storage ordinances for commercial areas, we didn't take the next step and prevent residential development in those areas without some standards on that development. And that corner lot that used to be where the store used to be, there's gonna be a house built right on that corner. And that's nuts to me. And if we don't take some action, that kind of thing is gonna continue. And it's just gonna make it more difficult for us to implement some of these plans.
Although I don't know, I mean, part of me wonders whether having those kind of spot properties, well, certainly I think, to Doug's point, MDOT isn't going to be happy if we add tons of curb cuts along that road.
MDOT gave permission for this house. Go
Right,
figure.
right. Well, I mean, yeah, but in general, so I'm familiar with commercial developments like plazas that have been built off-road. Like they share a road into them, a little bit like the Gray Plaza, but
Like a backlot.
like a
almost.
backlot development,
Yeah.
yeah. And I wonder if something like that might make some sense rather than, so that there's more controlled access. You potentially could have a light there, and there could be a little cluster of businesses that people could get to rather than, having to get in and out of their cars along a whole, half-mile section of road or something like that.
Once you get past the Mill Brook, until you get past Crystal Lake, there really aren't any lots that are suitable to that kind of development. I mean, once you get past Crystal Lake, between there and the Gloucester line, there are some backlots and some bigger pieces of property. And then on the Turnpike side of 26, between Hannaford and the Mill Brook, where Circle K is now, there are some big lots on that side of the road too. I know the folks that own the house across from North Raymond Road had wanted to do some commercial development in there.
they did.
But the constraints there, are, like you say, are huge.
It's a pretty, not to be defensive, on council packet page 13, it's a pretty small, and presumably compact, proposed commercial area.
Yeah.
And that was really intentional, to,
Yep.
again, with access control and then as I said in my memo, ringed by residential to support the vibrancy of that. That was the concept.
So this residential space around Dry Mills did expand beyond where it had been zoned that way or proposed that way as part of the comprehensive plan. Is that past Mayberry Road that the residential is expanding? Am I looking at that?
Mayberry takes off right at, you can see on
Right around
the
the
lower left-hand corner
Yeah.
of Crystal, that's Mayberry.
Okay, so can you define, just as you did for Ann a minute ago, for bed and breakfasts, like what would be your vision for a small mixed-use development in that residential space?
I could, and I would
Or
expect,
small multifamily structures, not mixed use.
so there might be a low-impact, non-residential use, maybe right up on the front, and then maybe a 4-unit multifamily structure behind it, as an
Okay.
example, and then as you get further away from, let's say, North Raymond Road, there would maybe be some larger 8-unit at the most, with some corresponding open land behind it,
Okay, I'm just trying to get a sense for what that would look like
Just
for traffic and.
off the cuff.
Yeah, okay.
Mike, Matthew? Ann, you have anything on that?
I'm all set on that.
No, I think I like the idea of this kind of pocket neighborhood expanding.
I'm not keen on, there is a neighborhood between Libby Hill and Fairview, where it's pretty well just, where it is all residential at this point in time. And I personally think the people who lived there would want to protect that. They certainly did they certainly had their concerns when Hannaford came to us and wanted to build where they were building. There were a lot of people who didn't feel that Hannaford was an appropriate use for that.
Well, I was just talking about Dry Mills still. Had we moved on to?
Well, it's in
Christian
that
Six?
area
Yeah.
though.
Oh, okay.
Right, and that, the
I see.
RMU area,
Okay. I think I see what, if I can interject, Mr. Chairman.
yeah, absolutely.
I think Counselor Chappell was asking for a vision, and this is my fault, was asking for what the vision might be for the residential area in Dry Mills.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That was not the intention, to your point, Counselor McGuire, with the residential area behind Spruce and Adler. The intention there was to go 1, maybe 2 lots deep with a residential mixed use, and then everything past that would be strictly residential.
Okay.
So
Yeah, yeah.
so that, and again, that's my fault. I probably shouldn't have the residential area at Dry Mills the same color,
Yeah,
the same
that'll
district,
help you.
because I think the vision may be slightly different.
Yeah.
My overall intention was to see if there was council support to continue to pursue this Dry Mills vision. That was,
I think there is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it needs more conversation and definition like you want to
Okay.
do, but yeah, I think there is
okay,
a desire to noodle that some more.
okay, very helpful, thank you.
Number 7, consensus, the north side of Shaker Road between Libby Hill and the MTA should be a commercial area with strict curb cut standards. That basically,
By the Wilkinson's property.
yeah. If you're looking at the Dry Mills page 13 map, you can still see most of that area that Doug's referring to.
Yep.
That blue there and the yellow is the park, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. And so you're talking about essentially from that blue area down along the bypass?
Hannaford to the Turnpike,
Yeah.
I think,
basically.
are you talking about the blue area or the red
The-
triangle that's?
The red triangle.
The red triangle, yeah.
Which is currently, for the most part,
So
residential.
I think it's mostly gravel pit and,
Mm,
right?
That's
No,
across
is that
the,
the-
that's
am I looking
across
at the
the,
wrong-
yeah.
It's the old.
That's
UT.
closer to the pink RA.
Let's zoom
is
in.
Where the gravel pit is.
Yep.
Okay.
It's not super dense. There's a,
No,
what
it's
is it?
not
There's
dense
that
at
medical
all.
building just
Oh,
this
it's, so
side
it's
of
really
Hannaford.
just that parcel
It's
that
across from the
Hannaford
fire
owns,
station.
that's kind of just
Yes.
undeveloped, yeah.
Between there and the bridge.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fine with that being commercial.
With-
I know it is close to our wellhead, so I
Yeah.
think we would need the overlay standards we
Okay.
talked about earlier, but.
With good curb cut standards. Yep.
What is this a transition? Oh, I guess I'm sort of popping over the turnpike, never mind, or Shaker Road.
It's the old BT 1 and 2.
Okay. The red triangle area does make sense to me.
Okay.
There's some existing residential in that area, but I think, but not a lot.
I think the use would be, defining the uses for that area would be, like the medical office that's there is a different kind of use than a Burger King.
Yes, traffic volume.
Yeah, traffic volume, I think, would be a big thing, because you don't, I mean, we have that piece that's trapped behind the hardware store and the solar farm that gentleman's tried to develop over the years, and traffic and the volume there, the MDOT's been loath to let any increase in traffic volume happen at that intersection.
That intersection's getting close, as predicted in the corridor study, that intersection's getting close to capacity, so.
It's a, yeah. So I think, yeah, under the right circumstances, I feel like there's support for that.
Yep.
This is great input. I appreciate it. This is,
I think that wraps it up. That was the
What
last of your
about 8?
questions.
I think, well,
Oh,
that,
one
well, we
more.
touched on those. I don't want to hold up. You guys have your meeting.
We kind of talked, not about it at this level, but
All right, yeah.
This is all about the transition zones.
Transition
Yeah, we
zones,
did, we
yeah.
did kind of jump around and touch on
and
a
this,
lot of
the
it.
Ls, the Ys, the Ps, the WGs,
I mean,
Not to be-
alphabet soup.
Like a rap
I
song.
feel
rap
like you
song.
laid us out this banquet, and I'm able to just eat the hors d'oeuvres or something, you know, so I apologize for that. This is, you know, the accumulation of, or a culmination of just a ton of work and deep thinking about what these, you know, what should happen in areas of town and what, you know, how they should be zoned and what's the implication for future development and impact on our watersheds. I mean, it's like, you know, 10D chess or something. I don't know how you
It's
do
a
it.
heavy lift.
But, so I appreciate all this work, and so in our next steps on this are just, you'll take what we said under advisement, and we'll have another workshop or something? Okay.
sure.
Yep.
I
that's the
appreciate
plan.
members of OAC attending. Thank you.
Yeah.
I asked them to.
Then we had some open space people here earlier.
Well, on the May workshop, you said fill in the white areas, and so I said, okay, I'm going to throw something on the table, and if they like it, and if they don't, then they'll tell me, and that's
I
good.
think the next time we get together and we do the workshop, we should also talk about how we start to share this more broadly to people who don't attend the
I think-
meetings.
Right, we had tossed around the need for that at OAC
Yeah.
also, so.
We're at a
Yeah.
point now
Yeah.
where I think
Yeah.
we've got enough stuff for folks to react to and give us some feedback.
Okay.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very
I
much.
Yeah.
appreciate the input.
With that, we'll adjourn our workshop, and it'll make us a little late, but we'll take a 5-minute break.
Great, thanks.